Amen.
Philippians chapter 2, verses 25 through 30. The Apostle Paul writes, "Yet I supposed it necessary to send to you Epaphroditus, my brother and companion in labor and fellow soldier, but your messenger and he that ministered to my wants. For he longed after you all and was full of heaviness, because that ye had heard that he had been sick. For indeed he was sick nigh unto death, but God had mercy on him, and not on him only, but on me also, lest I should have sorrow upon sorrow. I sent him therefore the more carefully, that when ye see him again, ye may rejoice, and that I may be the less sorrowful. Receive him therefore in the Lord with all gladness, and hold in such reputation, because for the work of Christ he was nigh unto death, not regarding his life, to supply your lack of service toward me." As one reads through the epistles of the Apostle Paul, it becomes evident that he crossed paths with many individuals. It would seem that some of these individuals were a hindrance to his work for the Lord. He talks about people in 2 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 14 who would subvert the gospel. In this particular letter, chapter 1 and verse 16, he talks about those who preached Christ out of contention and not out of sincerity. And he goes on even in 1 Timothy chapter 1, verses 19 and 20, he even names some folk. He names two men, Hymenaeus and Alexander, who had caused shipwreck or destroyed some people's faith. But most of the people that Paul met were a blessing to his life and to his ministry. And he closes just about every one of his letters with a personal note to some of these Christians. Matter of fact, in the last chapter of the book of Romans, Paul mentions over 35 people by name. And contrary to the trend in our modern society, Paul was a man who made friends as he traveled through life. Too many folk in our day are the opposite. We want to isolate and we want to insulate ourselves from others. But Paul touched folk. And folk touched Paul as he went through life. And here in our text this morning, Paul talks about one of these individuals, a man by the name of Epaphroditus. Here's somebody that we know almost next to nothing about. From his name, we would probably deduce correctly that he was a Greek and a Gentile. His name, Epaphroditus, literally means favored or loved by Aphrodite. Now, if you don't know anything about Greek mythology, Aphrodite was the Greek goddess of love. And she also had another interesting distinction. She was also the goddess of gamblers. Now that's going to come up a little bit later on. But I want you right now to focus on the fact that she was the goddess of love in Greek culture. And that name, Epaphroditus, eventually came to mean charming or lovely. And while we might not know much about Brother Epaphroditus, the small amount of information that Paul gives us tells us much about this special man. He carries the name Lovely, and he was a man who lived up to that name. We're given a glimpse of a man who possessed certain attributes that should be possessed by every born-again child of God. And this morning, I want to take a brief look at some of these characteristics as we look at the thought, the look of a lovely Christian.
Right.
The look of a lovely Christian. I want to give us 3 characteristics about what a lovely Christian looks like, and we'll be done for the morning. First thing I want you to consider, a lovely Christian is a balanced Christian.
Man.
A lovely Christian is a balanced Christian. Now, I don't know if you all have thought about this or not before, but it's very easy for Christians to get out of balance.
Amen.
That is, we can be prone to focus on one area of our Christian walk to the exclusion of other areas that are just as important. Some people get off balance in the area of fellowship. Everything is about the group and having a good time and being with our brothers and sisters, and there's nothing wrong with that. For others, it's evangelism. Everything revolves around dealing with the lost, but in the process, they ignore spiritual development and growth. Definitely nothing wrong with evangelism. For some, it's this idea of legalism. They're so concerned with keeping things in line with their idea of how things ought to be that they set themselves up as spiritual detectives. And they look at their job as to investigate and correct the motives of others. And there's nothing wrong with wanting to stay in line with the law of God and trying to show others where they're wrong. But when a Christian gets out of balance, their actions tend to cause or to bring reproach upon the cause of Christ. They can be just like a wobbly tire on a car. And you already know, if you've been driving for a while, if something is wrong with just one of the 4 tires on your car, the car is not going to ride right. But Epaphroditus wasn't like this. We see here about what Paul says about him, that he was balanced in his walk with the Lord. And I want you just to see 3 areas of his life where he was balanced. First of all, Paul lets us know that he was balanced in his walk as a son. Paul calls him my brother. And that just simply refers to those who are members of the same family, or those who are united in the bonds of affection. It just simply means this: I love Epaphroditus and he loves me. We are brothers in Jesus Christ. it lets us know that he walked with Paul and not against him. And that's important because every believer ought to strive for balance here. Amen. See, we're in this thing together whether you want to accept that or not. Amen. Amen. Our walk is a joint walk in a lot of ways. And we should love one another and stand together. There's no room in the Christian walk for brothers and sisters to always be attacking other brothers and sisters. Amen. Preach. In fact, the Bible makes it clear, Matthew 22 and verses 37 through 39, that we are duty bound to love one another. Amen. Jesus goes on even further. He makes this thing, love for our brother, the calling card and the primary identifying mark of the church. Yeah. And when there isn't love and mutual concern and unity among God's children, someone is out of balance in their walk. Amen. Paul not only referred to him as brother, dealing with his walk as a son, he also lets us know that Epaphroditus was balanced in his work as a servant. Paul calls him his companion in labor. In other words, he was a fellow worker with Paul. He shouldered his portion of the load. He wasn't a loafer who let everybody else do the work, who let other folk carry his part. He went in there and did his work for the glory of the Lord alongside of the Christians. Amen. Verse 25 tells us that he was a messenger and a minister. And the history behind all of this is just simply this. He was sent by the church at Philippi with some support for Paul. He was their messenger. But I think the greatest gift from Philippi was Epaphroditus himself, and that was simply because of this. When he arrived in Rome, where Paul was, Epaphroditus not only delivered the support from the church at Philippi to Paul, but he also rolled up his sleeves and went to work with Paul. Amen. In his walk, he was balanced. That refers here to the fellowship of the gospel. And this is where many believers get out of whack and out of balance. You see, sometimes we just love to be with the brethren, and there's nothing wrong with loving to be with the brethren. And we think that a little fellowship with their friends at church or with their class is all that they need to be complete. But the fact of the matter is this. God did not save us simply for us to fellowship. He saved us to get work out of us for his glory. And it's a shame that 90% of the work in the typical congregation is done by 10% of the folk. Amen, Walls. Let me say that again. Typically, 90% of the work in the average congregation is done by 10% of the folk in that congregation. There's a whole lot of work for fellow workers to be doing. Amen. But a shortage of people that are willing to do it. Now, Epaphroditus, Paul lets us know he was a fellowshipper, but he was also willing to roll up his sleeves and get involved in the work that needed to be done. Amen. But not only was he balanced in his walk as a son and in his work as a servant, watch this. Paul also lets us know that he was balanced in his warfare as a soldier. Paul calls him a fellow soldier. And what he's talking about there, he's talking about a man who is an associate in the spiritual conflicts of the Christian walk. That term, fellow soldier, was a very common term back in Roman days. It simply meant that one person who fought alongside and with another. They were partners in a common struggle. They were shoulder to shoulder fighting the fight. Man. And there's a great need in this day and time for believers who are willing to roll up their sleeves and fight alongside other believers in this spiritual warfare that we face. I believe sometimes the problem is we don't even believe we at war. That we done been saved and secured in Christ and everything's just going to be all right, that he calls us on. Paul tells you in Ephesians chapter 6, you in a fight.
Yes, sir.
And you're not in no ordinary fight either. And you need folk in that fight with you who are willing to fight alongside you. But that fight looks a lot different than a lot of times what we're also willing to admit there. See, a lot of times when we talk about the Christian fight and contending for the faith, what we do a lot of times is we set ourselves up as judge and jury on what others around them should be doing and should not be doing.
All right.
That ain't the fight Paul's talking about. No. See, my fight in the spiritual realm ain't against Chris and what Chris is doing wrong, in my opinion.
Preach.
The enemy that I'm fighting alongside with, or and I'm fighting, is a whole lot more craftier than Chris is.
Yes, sir. Preach.
And what I need to realize is that while I'm fighting this, or having to deal with this enemy, I should not be wasting my time fighting Chris, but I need Chris on my side as we fight this enemy.
Man.
Not trying to nitpick at everything Chris is doing, not that's wrong, but stuff that I don't like.
Man.
We lose sight of who the real enemy is. Paul lets us know Epaphroditus didn't have this problem. He's my fellow soldier. Which means that he's fighting with me on the same things that I'm fighting against.
Amen.
And if we're going to fight, let us fight against Satan and his deeds, not against each other.
Amen.
We don't even get to pick the fight. Last time I checked, I was a private in the fight. The general is Jesus. He's the one who tells us who to fight. I don't get to pick who to fight as a private.
Amen.
I just follow orders.
Yes, sir. Preach.
Epaphroditus, Paul says, is a balanced believer. He was active in all of these areas of the Christian walk. He was balanced in his walk. He was balanced in his work. He was balanced in his warfare. But not only is a lovely Christian a balanced Christian, watch this. A lovely Christian is also a burdened Christian. Look carefully with me at 26 and 27. Paul says this about Epaphroditus. For he longed after you all, and was full of heaviness, because that ye had heard that he had been sick. For indeed he was sick, nigh unto death. Paul tells us, first of all, that Epaphroditus was very sick. He was sick almost to the point of death. Now, some might ask the question, well, Paul had healed other folk. If Epaphroditus was so sick, why didn't Paul heal Epaphroditus? Well, the passage here lets us know something very important. His sickness was not the focus of what was going on. His focus was the brothers and sisters who had sent him to Paul and were back in Philippi. Look at the text real carefully. The problem wasn't that Epaphroditus was sick. The problem was Epaphroditus had heard that word had gotten back to Philippi that he was sick. And watch this. Epaphroditus' concern was not on him and his sickness. It was on how the brothers and sisters were going to react when they heard that he was sick. In other words, he was worried that they were going to be too concerned about him and his condition. He did not want to be a burden in the minds of his brothers and sisters back in Philippi. Matter of fact, watch this. He uses the term here that he was full of heaviness. Now I want you to see how much or how deep that is. It's the same Greek term that was used back in Matthew 26, 37 and 38. Y'all know what was happening back then? Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane was praying to his Father right before his death. And he was so burdened, the Bible tells us that his blood was as drops of sweat. I know that some people, when they read that passage, they try to say, well, that means that his blood, he was sweating so much, it was like he was bleeding sweat. No, that ain't what that means. It's actually a medical condition that is caused by extreme stress that causes you to actually sweat blood out of your sweat pores. This is how burdened Epaphroditus was in his concern about his brothers and sisters hearing about how sick he was. He didn't want them to worry about him. He wasn't focused on his own condition. He wasn't focused on his own needs. His focus was on others and their welfare. In other words, here's a supreme example of somebody who displayed absolute Christ-likeness in the situation they had. Let me ask a question this morning. How many of us can only see as far as our noses to the end of our noses? I run into so many folk who call themselves children of God, and everything they want to talk about is, what about me? How is this going to affect me? How are people going to look at me?
That's right. Amen.
That ain't Christ-like. Matter of fact, I'm going to drop it on you. That ain't even people-like.
Amen. Amen.
That's the realm of babies and animals.
That's right.
you know that you're maturing as a Christian when your first thought is not about how something affects you, but how it might affect somebody else. Here's somebody who was the essence of what a believer ought to be when it came to their concern with others. And there's nothing more immature than a believer who thinks about his or her needs first.
Man.
What if Jesus had thought that way? What if Jesus had took the attitude, well, I don't need to go to Calvary. I didn't see him. Where would you be? What if Paul would have been like, I don't need to go to Rome to preach the gospel. I already heard the gospel. I'm already saved. I ain't going over there to bother with them folks. Let them get it themselves. But watch this. Because Epaphroditus was a person who was concerned about folk, he was a person who brought joy to the lives of others. Look at Paul, what he says about Epaphroditus. Verse 28, I sent him, therefore the more carefully, that when ye see him again, ye may rejoice, and that I may be the less sorrowful. Receive him, therefore, in the Lord with all gladness, and hold such in reputation. See, Paul realized that these Philippian Christians knew what a treasure they had in Epaphroditus. Here's a person who made you feel important and loved. Here's a person who would put you first. Here's somebody who was an encourager, and because of those characteristics, here's a person who was a joy to know and to be around.
Yeah.
How do people look at you when they see you coming? Are people joyful when they're in your presence? Because of the characteristics that you display to them? I've been around some Christians who, when folks see them, they run the other way. Because they always bitter and negative, controversial, and judgmental. We ought to be a joy to be around. Folk ought to want to be in our company when we display the attributes that we ought to display. And that happened with Epaphroditus. Paul tells us, when you see Epaphroditus again, I send him to you because I know that when you see him, you're going to be happy. Lovely Christians, a balanced Christian, a burdened Christian, but let me give you this last one and we'll be done. Paul says that a lovely Christian is also a brave Christian. Look at verse number 30. The apostle says, because for the work of Christ, he was nigh unto death, not regarding his life, to supply your lack of service toward me. Now Paul isn't saying Epaphroditus did what he did because y'all didn't do what y'all should have did. See, a lot of people read that last line, your lack of service, to mean that the Philippian church didn't do anything for Paul. That ain't the truth. In fact, Paul talks primarily about how good the Philippian church has supported him. But what he's talking about is simply this: it ain't got there yet. See, it ain't like today's time when I want to, send you some support, send you some money. I pull out my phone and use PayPal or Cash App. It had to physically go there, which meant that it was a long journey over land or over water. And while the Philippian support was getting to Paul, Paul had Epaphroditus there to help him. But watch this. Paul says, because of the work of Christ, he was nigh unto death, not regarding his own life. Now, it seems to me, just by a casual reading, that Epaphroditus was sick, and the sickness was the result of his labors for the Lord. The ancient church tradition tells us that Epaphroditus was known for his work among the sick folk in Rome. And it is said that he and others would try to help folk that other folk would not dare go near. Let me liken it to something that you might understand. If you went into some hospitals, some of the more advanced hospitals have what they call isolation rooms or isolation wards. And when somebody catches something that's very contagious, they would put them in one of those isolation rooms. And the conditions of that isolation room was such that there was nothing that was supposed to be able to get out and infect somebody else. The room, the air was pressurized so that nothing would flow out carried by the air. You had to have protective garments on at all times in that room that would cover every inch of your body, and where it was totally sealed where nothing could get in. Now, we know we have diseases in times like this where people have to be put in those isolation wards. But guess what? They also had those in the ancient world. And they didn't have the wherewithal to deal with them like we do now in 21st century modern times. But still, somebody had to go and care for these folk who had these illnesses. Yeah. Tradition lets us know that Epaphroditus was one of these types of folk who would put everything on the line in order to serve and to help his fellow man. And that could be the cause why he's sick unto death. In his service to others, he done caught something that has gotten him that ill. What are you trying to say, preacher? Simply this. Here's a man who was willing to put everything on the line, including his health and his life, in order to do service to God and to his fellow man. He went and worked with folk and took care of folk at no fault of how it was going to affect him negatively. Now I realize now that if Murph has some rare contagious disease and I get too close to Murph, I might catch it. You ain't got that, do you, Murph? I need to get away from it. But at time, even if Murph has this, and Murph needs my care, I should be willing to get with him and to do what I can for him, not regarding my own safety. I know that's kind of hard for some folks. But that's just everything. I mean, if you look at it, I told you something about Aphrodite a moment ago, who Epaphroditus was named after. Aphrodite was the goddess of gamblers. Epaphroditus, as the language moved and developed, that name came to mean someone who voluntarily hazards one's own welfare and exposes oneself to danger. It was a term that was used to describe what gamblers did when they put their money on the table and exposed it to the dangers of loss. It meant to place everything on a roll of the dice. In fact, back then, many times when gamblers would gamble and they had everything on the line, as they would gamble, they would yell out the name Epaphroditus. They were looking for Aphrodite to look favorably upon their wager. One missionary put it this way. Here's a man who had given his life trying to reach the natives in South America. He said this: he is no fool who gives what he cannot keep to gain what he cannot lose. He is no fool who gives what he cannot keep to gain what he cannot lose. Too often we're so busy trying to keep what we can't keep that we never gain what we can't lose once we get it.
Amen.
I'm trying to protect my life. I'm trying to be safe. Guess what? I don't care how safe you are. Somewhere down the road, you're going to die.
Preach.
What then? And in the process of trying to keep what we can't keep our lives, we lose out on the blessings of Christ. Amen. Epaphroditus was so lovely in his service for Christ that he was willing to lay down his life. He was willing to gamble his life in the service of somebody else. But I need to tell you something. When you throw down your life for the cause of Christ, you're not gambling away your life in the game of chance. It's not, what if? Y'all know how gambling works. I know y'all don't hang out in the casinos, but y'all have seen it on TV and stuff. A lot of times when folk are at the gambling table and they put their chips down, they're thinking a whole lot of what ifs in both ways. You hear folk, when the lotto, the Powerball jackpots get big, what if I hit this jackpot? You hear talk about all of the stuff they're going to do. But I've also heard it the other way. What if I gamble all of this money and I lose? Hey, I ain't going to be able to pay my rent this month. My kids going to go hungry. There's always a what if when you're gambling. But not when you're gambling for the cause of Christ.
Yeah.
Not when you're willing to wager it all for the Lord's work. Because God's a sovereign God.
Amen.
What does that mean? He's in control of it all. And laying it down for his cause, he's not going to let you lose it.
Yes, sir.
You can put it all on the line for him.
Amen.
But in conclusion, Paul tells the Philippian church to hold Epaphroditus in reputation. Now that phrase simply means to prize or to value, to consider precious. Epaphroditus, Paul says, was to be prized. He was to be considered precious. Why? Because people like him are rare and of great value.
Amen.
Y'all know what the church needs. No, we don't need money. Don't take that literally. This is God's boat, and God knows how to keep it afloat with or without your money. Money ain't the need. We don't need prestige in the community. Because when the church is doing what it's supposed to do, we are going to be out of step with the world anyway.
Amen.
We don't need political influence because one day all of this mess is going to go up in flames anyway.
Preach.
What we really need is for more folk to step up and be like Epaphroditus. We need more folk who are willing to put it all on the line
Amen.
for Jesus Christ, who will hold nothing back, who are balanced in their walk and who are burdened for others and who are brave enough to lay it all on the line for Christ.
Yeah.
Just that, given just that, God can use all of it for his glory.
Amen.
Are you a lovely Christian this morning? You know what one looks like. Are you one? If you're not, do you want to be one? Do you want to be somebody who God can use for his glory? Do you want to be somebody who walks like a Christian ought to walk? Who carries the burdens that a Christian ought to carry for others? And who are willing to give everything that they have and that they are for the cause of Christ Jesus? I'll let you in on a little secret. Listen real closely. God can't use nobody who ain't.
Amen.
And he doesn't. If you want to be on the side of God, you have to have these characteristics of a lovely Christian.
Amen.
But the beautiful thing about all of that is simply this: if you don't have them, you're not trying to get them all alone on your own power. God strengthens and builds up those who allow him to strengthen and build them up.
Amen.
He puts people in your life who are willing to help you get there. That's why it's so important that this Christian walk is not a Lone Ranger thing. Because when I need to be built up, when I need to be strengthened, even when I need to be corrected, God puts people in the path.
Amen.
That's why a community of Christians is so important. That's why I need people like Murph. To encourage, to correct even, support. And we need each other.
Amen.
That's why God gave us each other.
That's right.
If that's what you want to be, God will make sure you have what you need to be that. And then he can use you to bring glory upon himself and his cause. If you're not a child of God this morning, you can do so. You can make sure that you don't leave here today without having made Jesus your choice. You've heard his word. You've heard how he died for your sins. Believe what you heard. Repent of all of your sins. Turn away from it. Confess that he is the Christ and that he is God's Son. And be buried with him in baptism for the remission of your sins. And if that's your desire this morning, we invite you to come right now as we stand and as we sing the Lord's song of invitation. Won't you come right now?